Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web and in public print media books, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Gordon. Always a pleasure.
Last night you had an earthquake in California, and I'm in the middle of one of the worst blizzards we've had in New England in years. So let's hope the link stays up for our show.
That's right.
It's always something, and some of the issues we've had from Hawaii. But let's just jump right in, Charles. This will be the first of a three-part series, which we've entitled 2018, Year of Accelerating Social Change. And the three parts are entitled, as you can see here, Time for a Change, Social Change Accelerating, and Preparing for Major Social Change. Today we'll focus solely on time for a change. There are many reasons why the time has arrived that this will force social change, but due to time, we've distilled it down to what you and I feel are really four key pillars. Is there anything you'd like to mention first of all?
No, I think we're talking about a roadmap here in a way that is a very dynamic system. So we're really just kind of sketching an outline of what we anticipate, not just for 2018, but probably for the next 5 to 10 years. So I think it's a great topic. These are all important subjects.
A lot of the subjects in the three-part that we'll go through, you've written extensively on. I've also written on, so we can refer you to our site. But let's start with inequality, your views on how inequality is now driving or will drive social change.
We've had several programs that have mentioned that central bank policies, zero interest rates and quantitative easing, the purchasing of assets, all of these policies have exacerbated the wealth and income inequality that have been rising on a secular level for decades. In other words, the good times for the working class and lower middle class were the early 1970s, and wages for the bottom, say 60%, have been stagnating for decades, and now the income for the bottom 90% has been stagnating since the central banks have pursued policies which basically enrich the already wealthy, the folks and institutions that own the stocks and bonds and commercial real estate. So they have actively made the problem worse. But the problems are also beneath that level. They're structural. And we've spent many programs talking about this, that, costs are rising, especially for big ticket items like healthcare and higher education and rent and housing. And while the central bank policies have made these extremes worse, even if they change their policies, they can't really modify these structural forces, and one of which is demographics, right? That plays out over generations, and then we have on top of all that, we have a cyclical cycle in which that we've talked about in the past with discussing author Peter Turchin's work on these cycles of social order and social disorder, and we're obviously entering a multi-year period of social disorder and fragmentation. And we can see the previous cycle was the early 20th century, where there were huge technological disruptions, and there was social disorder, a rise of terrorism, domestically and internationally, very similar to what we see today. So these are the three elements that we see that are driving inequality and higher costs and the corruption of our governance system. That includes government and our legal system, which I've listed here. It's like where is there a competent government? It's very hard to find, and politicians are acting out of political expediency. They're not really addressing the underlying issues or problems. They're just papering it over with quantitative easing and deficit spending.
Without question. Charles, in terms of your comments on cycles, I do a lot of work on cycles, and as many people do, and I was stunned the other day. I was looking at long-term Gann charts, and which is a technical set of theories, and how closely they mapped into other longer-term Kondratiev cycles, etc. But what was telling to me, he did his work most of his work in 1910, over 100 years ago through 1920. But in that period of time, He was projecting that we would have major social change and therefore effective in the financial markets in 2019 through 2021. And I thought that's just too much of a coincidence. And why that's important, his work stems very close to the Elliott wave theory, which is about social change, social mood, and how it shifts and runs in cycles that are multi-generational. We keep learning. We don't learn from history. We all have to come through and experience it in a new fashion. And so it's amazing how it's cyclical and repeats itself. In that context, this inequality, Charles, I see as being in really a new gilded era. And I don't say that positively, because as we, the last time we had one was the advent of the Industrial Revolution. But this one's something different. It's about globalization and financialization of the global economy versus the production, which the Industrial Revolution was about, and trade and products that were being created, and out of those came savings, and savings was sent back into productive assets, which created increased standards of living and created wealth. Today, because we're not putting it into production in this new Gilded Age, it's going into asset appreciation. And that's why I say gilded, because the wealth is not distributed now as it was then, and the rich are getting richer and the poor are not sharing with it. Because different in that the Industrial Revolution, there actually was a level of sharing. Everybody, the factory workers, got higher wages. Their standards of living all went up. That's not the case today. The rich are getting richer and the poor are poorer. We have a two-class society, if you would. We have the haves and the have-nots, or in economics theory, rentiers and then the rest. And the point here is that it never works for any protracted period of time. History tells us that. That's why this social change is happening when you get this degree of inequality, and it's now recognized very much in that context.
That's a great context for our discussion of social disorder. And I think that we need to speak about the last point I would make is about the corruption, the cronyism, the self-serving elites, the pay-to-play democracy we have. People naturally look to a political solution to, technological disruption, social change, and economic inequality, right? But our system of governance is as broken as our financial system. And so what we have is a pyramid, is what I visualize it as, where the wealth and power are concentrated at the very top. And so when you look at all these political crises or accusations of collusion, both from the Republican and Democratic side, it's all about colluding to protect wealth or hide wealth, really, whether it's the Russians and the uranium deal, or whether it's Trump selling to Russian plutocrats or meeting with Russian plutocrats. We can see that the elite class of America is completely self-serving and corrupted. And so we're not going to get the political change. That's not going to solve the problems. And so that's why the social disorder is not going to be resolved by political change, because our system of governance has been as corrupted as our financial system.
Our system has been corrupted maybe since its inception, and corruption is very broad-based and frankly accelerating at a significant rate. But people will tolerate corruption. Matter of fact, they won't pay a lot of attention to it if their standard of living is increasing, if they feel all right, or they can raise their families with some independence from it. They just kind of tolerate it and shrug their shoulders. But when they can't, their standard of living, and they're having difficulties, that's when corruption becomes a real problem to them and becomes a social driver. And you can see that throughout history. And, I wrote an extensive paper on what I call the crony tribute system, of how our political system is now working. And you see it with no prosecutions, few indictments compared to what I used to see as a younger man. It's so noticeable. Antitrust legislations, etc., where they're blatantly easy to see. They're just not happening. And a reason for that, Charles, in my mind, is we've politicized our legal system. To get an indictment, it's almost a matter of politics of whether the indictment will be issued. I mean, at smaller crime levels, yes, but I'm talking about when you get into control fraud and things like that you've written on, it's much more difficult. So the corruption is there, and it's not being ferreted out. And that's why the change will not happen through the political system. It's going to happen through massive social change. And one of the issues we also have is we have this total a crisis of trust, a lack of confidence now in the leadership. And when you get a lack of confidence, you get uncertainty. You lose optimism. And when this starts to happen, what happens is investment slows. You start to get stagnation. There's a direct cause and effect. And I did a thesis paper in 2016 on the degree of this crisis of trust and how much it's now impacting our investment cycles and where the money is now going with less risk, apparent risk. I mean, though risk, I think, is totally mispriced.
I think you've really nailed it with the crisis of trust. And I would just add to your statement about how it's affecting our investment is it also accelerates short-term thinking. In other words, if you get into a permanent crisis mode of expediency, then you're no longer willing to commit to some longer-term investment. You just want to invest for this quarter, right? You're just hoping to make your numbers or get a return in the next few weeks or months, and this drives a speculative sort of mentality, which acts as sort of kryptonite to the sort of long-term investments that actually pay long-term yields to society in general. And so we've become a society where speculators are rewarded for buying the dips and front-running the central bank's monetary stimulus, and to the detriment of society as a whole, which only benefits from long-term investments in productivity.
Charles, we have to wrap, but I just make one point on the standard of living shown here, and it ties into politics. You know, we have new major costs that are, like, for example, pensions have gone away. We went from defined benefits to contributory benefits. That has a massive impact to a society where there's no pensions, or the pensions are totally underfunded, or you're not going to get them. And that's evolved in the last 20 years. Education itself is totally out of line with what it was 20 years ago, and massive bills for any family trying to get children through school. We all know about medical costs. We all know these things. And the point here is they're through the roof, but we see no political action to solve them. And that is what creates social change. When they see the political process not listening for whatever reason, and right now they probably perceive it's corrupt, and so therefore they force the change, and that's why we're in the middle, and we will see accelerating social change. And matter of fact, Charles, we're going to break here, but this is in part 2. That's actually what we're going to get into: accelerating social change, and possible new economic and financial systems, as well as the types of solutional arguments, if I can call them that we're hearing more and more disgustingly discussed in the media as part of the public narrative, and where it's leading us to, which can be bad or maybe good. So we'll come back and talk on another day about part 2. Any closing comments?
No, I'm looking forward to discussing accelerating social change next time.
Talk to you next week, Charles.
Thank you.